Hi, this week we are talking about focus and depth of field. The chapter also covers lenses. We'll touch a little bit about lenses. So just kind of remember kind of a cool little quote here when we talk about focus from John Karamak, who was a video game designer. Some of you may recognize the name from popular video games that you enjoy. And he says that focus is a matter of deciding what things you're not going to do. So, of course, we're talking a little bit different here when we talk about focus in photography, but it does have some parallels with focus in your life, what you're going to focus on. And so the idea here is, in focus, when we have our overall images, we need to try and have that big depth of field so you can see the whole image, because we're oftentimes going to be asked, well, what are you hiding in the blurry areas? So in that sense, we need to decide what we're going to leave out. Well, we're not going to leave out anything. We're going to try and make everything in focus. You might not be able to see the details per se on things like a small item laying on the floor, but you can tell that it's there. Again, in our mid-range, we're going to be asking, what are you hiding? So you think about like the mid-range photos when we remember back to what we learned about the process, overall mid-range close-up. And so the idea here is that when you have a mid-range photo, you're showing 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, and that these 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, we need to be able to see what they are. We might not be able to read all the details about them, but if you've got a gun and a knife and some blood on the floor and you're showing an image with these 3 pieces of evidence, here, here, and here, well, you want to be able to actually tell that's a gun, that's a knife, and that is the blood spatter. And then lastly, in our close-ups, if we can't get good focus, like the example right here on the screen, we have a firearm and, we can't see the details now. So the overall in the mid-range, we might not be able to see the details per se, but what we are looking for is to actually see that it is an object. Is it a firearm? Is it a knife? Is it some blood spatter? Is it, a credit card? Is it a wallet? Is it a cell phone? And when we get into the close-ups, now we need to be cognizant of, can we see the details? Can we figure out what kind of gun it is? Can we read a little bit of information on the knife, whatever the case may be? So when we think back to talking about, camera purchases, and we said, a lot of camera salespeople in your big box stores, they get very concerned about megapixels. Well, it's not always about the megapixels. Sometimes it's about resolution. And so when we start talking about resolution, now you're seeing the ability to separate closely spaced items. So when you have high resolution, you see the top there where you have a whole bunch of horizontal lines. Well, in a high resolution setting, the lines look very distinct and they are very separate. But when you get into a lower resolution camera or have lower resolution settings, now things get a little blurry. The lines are not as succinct. They aren't bleeding over and crossing over into each other, but they're not as crisply defined lines that you can't sit there and see the edge of one line where it ends. It kind of like gradients off into the white space. Something else that we deal with is acutance, and this is the ability for the camera to actually render the sharp edges. So we can have high resolution, but sometimes we will then have a trade-off with a lower acutance. And so you can see here again where the top image has a nice distinct line, and the bottom image we end up with kind of this gradient that goes on before we finally get to the edge of something. So resolution is the ability to separate things out, and acutance is the ability to render a straight line, or a sharp edge, I should say, not a straight line. So what happens then is, based on your resolution and your acutance, we get sharpness. Sometimes sharpness is something that we kind of play with our focusing, so that we can take and make an image look pretty. When we are dealing with artistic photography, there are some things that come into play with our focus so that you can make an object or a person more artistically beautiful. So, you can see here some portrait type photography where they say that one thing is too soft, the model's kind of too blurred out. And as we get to the middle here, this is about perfect. This is what magazine folks are looking for. You can tell a little bit of detail about the hair, You can see some individual, marks on the face. You can actually see the details. But now we're getting too sharp, where you've got a couple of stray hairs here, and they just really stand out as being stray hairs. You got some imperfections, blemishes in the face that just jump right out at you. So here again, you're looking at not enough detail, and here we're looking at way too much detail. And so the idea in the magazine photographer world is, this is what they're looking for. Kind of just showing this as it relates to, your camera and what your ability is on your camera. So you can have, a low resolution camera, but has high accutance. And so you end up where you've got the image here, where it's, kind of blurry-ish. You've got some weird distortions going on. The camera's able to create sharp edges, but because there's no definition between them, you end up with kind of these weird data error things, like here and here, where it just gets kind of blocky. Versus here, low accutance, but high resolution. We've got lots of details, but everything kind of blends together. It slides together. It just looks like a simply blurry photo. And then here where we have both high accutance and high resolution, everything is crisp, everything is in focus, everything is sharp. So again, just kind of showing what we're looking at here when we take a look at an image, and we can have, say, like the idea of the lines, where you can't have as many lines, or you can have a whole bunch of them. You can have a distinct difference between the lines, or you have this slight little gradient going on between the lines. So from a CSI standpoint, we would like to have both high accutance and high resolution. Now, one other thing that really doesn't come up in this chapter, but is important to remember when we start talking about focus and depth of field, is perspective. And when you start dealing with perspective, you start dealing with your sense of depth in an image. Now, a lot of times we have what are called visual clues that give us a sense of depth. So, in the old kind of cliched image here of the railroad tracks, as you're standing looking down a bunch of railroad tracks, they all kind of move back, and they have what we call a vanishing point. And it just kind of naturally, our eye is drawn back to this vanishing point, and that creates this sense of depth, where that this picture, the background is hundreds of yards away, if not maybe, you're out on an open highway, and the highway recedes back and vanishes, and that it's a mile away, even though you have nothing else to really give you a sense of depth. Maybe you've got like a couple of train cars, or maybe you got some signposts along the side of the highway, but eventually our depth kind of gives us or the perspective here gives us a good depth perception and allows it to vanish. Reason I bring this up is when we start talking here in a second about lenses, we need to be aware of the fact that our focal length and our zooming on those lenses will create perspective distortions. And there's a couple different, perspective distortions that are brought up, whether it's a barrel distortion or some of the other distortions that go on, where what we don't want to have happen is create these distortions. And I believe I showed you these photos in a previous PowerPoint here in class. If not, I'm sorry. But so here we have normal focal length. You have this car frame, parallel lines. And when we take and we use telephoto, so we stand back from this car frame and we try to zoom into it to see, what you end up with is what should be parallel lines now start to bow out, and so the car frame looks like it's bent. Likewise, when we take and we stand too close to the subject, and so we try to go with a wide angle view, what ends up happening is now, we end up with a different kind of bowing going on, where we create a situation where, what's closer to us appears wider, and what's further away from us appears to get narrower. So we don't want to create some of these distortions. Likewise here, we've got a building, normal perspective on the right, and what happens is when we start, trying to get more of the image in our view, and so we go with a wider angle lens, or we take our lens and we zoom back to make it a wider angle lens, what you end up with is now these buildings have bowed out, something we do not want to do. All right, so We're reaching about the 10-minute mark, so I'm going to cut this particular lecture off. We will be picking up here and talking about some additional information with perspective distortion, and then get into talking about lenses in the next recording.